Once upon a time, a mouse and a bird and a sausage lived and kept house together in perfect peace among themselves and in great prosperity. It was the bird's business to fly to the forest every day and bring back wood. The mouse had to draw the water, make the fire, and set the table. And the sausage had to do the cooking. That is the beginning of a folktale by perhaps the most famous folklorists of all time, the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm gave us stories like Rapunzel, Cinderella, and Hansel and Gretel. And according to legend, they collected these stories by visiting the peasants out in the fields and in local pubs and inns, and writing down these stories verbatim, as the peasants told them. But is that legend really true? And what does this all have to do with language? Welcome to Jack of All Languages, the show where we travel through time and across cultures, one language at a time. In today's episode, we'll look at the legendary lives and works of the Brothers Grimm, famous not only for their fairy tales, but also for their contributions to the field of linguistics. In particular, their insights about sound changes that helped linguists begin reconstructing extinct languages like Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Germanic. Born in 1785 and 1786, respectively, in Hanau, Germany, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm grew up in a large family that fell into poverty after their father died. The brothers became the heads of the Grimm household, and they both went on to Marburg University to study law, to make a better life for themselves and their family. Due to their social status, however, they were treated unequally at the university, and they struggled to find work as lawyers. Jakob finally took a job as the librarian at the private library of the King of Westphalia, and Wilhelm later joined him as a librarian too. It was during this time working at the library that the brothers developed a keen interest in German culture and stories, and the language in which these stories were transmitted. They began collecting folk tales as a way of preserving their heritage and arriving at a deeper understanding of the German language. The folktales they collected had only ever been passed down orally, and scholars hadn't ever bothered with them much, because these stories weren't considered the kind of high literature worth studying. But Jakob and Wilhelm came to believe that these stories represented the simple wisdom and virtue of the common people, and they felt it was super important to preserve the stories. It's important to note here that when the Grimm brothers spoke of the common folk of Germany, they were talking about a linguistic category, not a biological or racial one. But over the years, many scholars have criticized the Grimm brothers' ideas about the virtue of the German people, because it was too easy for people with racist ideologies to misconstrue them. With that said, the Grimm brothers published their first volume of folktales in 1812, called Children's and Household Tales, or Kinder- und Hausmärchen. And for the rest of their careers, in addition to their work as librarians and eventually university professors, they continued to collect folktales, and their books became very popular. Of course, now they're known all over the world. But their purpose was never actually to provide entertaining bedtime stories for children. They were happy that the books were being read to children and that the children enjoyed them, but according to Jakob, his true purpose was always more academic. "I did not write the storybook for children," he once remarked, "although I rejoice that it is welcome to them. But I would not have worked over it with pleasure if I had not believed that it might not appear and be important for poetry, mythology, and history to the most serious and elderly people, as well as to myself." So, let's talk about the linguistic side of this story. The Grimm brothers were interested in the German language and its dialects, and how the language had come to be. A few years after publishing their first volume of folktales, Jakob published his German grammar. In this book, he outlined the set of systematic sound changes he had observed across the Germanic languages. These included sound changes like the p sound from Proto-Indo-European evolving into a f sound in Proto-Germanic. So the root that gave us pater and ped in Latin became father and foot in English. These sound changes came to be known as Grimm's Law, and they gave rise to the methodology that linguists would go on to use to reconstruct ancient languages for which we don't have written evidence. The way this reconstruction works is basically a linguist can look at these sound changes that occurred in Germanic and then work backwards, comparing the changes to sound changes in other Indo-European languages, and make a very educated guess about what the root of all these cognates would have sounded like. Using this methodology, linguists have now reconstructed over 2,000 root words from Proto-Indo-European. Now let's look at some of the other sound changes that Grimm and other linguists discovered in the Germanic languages. The voice consonants b, d, and g from Proto-Indo-European remained the same in Latin and Greek, but became the unvoiced p, t, and k in Germanic, giving us the following cognate pairs in Latin and English: dens, tooth; domare, tame; granum, corn. The voiceless consonants p, t, and k from Proto-Indo-European again stayed the same in Latin, but changed to the fricatives f, th, and h in Germanic. And that last sound, the voiceless velar fricative, later just became a regular H sound in English. From this list, we have the Latin-English cognate pairs ped, foot; tres, three; cor, heart. Proto-Indo-European also had a set of voiced aspirates, something like buh, duh, and guh, which became fricatives f or h in Latin, and voice stops b, d, and g in Germanic. This last set of changes gives us the Latin-English cognate pairs frater, brother; fores, door; and hostis, guest. There are dozens, even hundreds, of other cognate pairs like these between Latin, English, Greek, German, Spanish, and other Indo-European languages. And in fact, I just used one of them, hundred. If you can think of a word that is cognate with hundred in another Indo-European language, write it down below in the comments. Lastly, let's address one thing I mentioned earlier in the video that I haven't gotten around to discussing yet. That is the Grimm brothers' methodology for collecting their fairy tales. Did they really travel around to the villages, talking with the locals in the pubs to record these stories? As cool as it would be if that were true, unfortunately the answer is no. The brothers actually collected most of their tales from educated, middle-class women living in town. And after writing down the tales, they manipulated them to make them sound more rural, more dialectal. So even though Jakob said that their first aim in collecting these stories has been exactness and truth, they actually fibbed the language of these tales a good bit to make them seem more authentic. That is all for today. Thank you for watching Jack of All Languages. Until next time.